Somewhere in the hill country of central Virginia, there is a farmstead that no longer appears on any county map. The land remains. You can walk it if you know where to look, but the records that once described it were quietly removed from the courthouse ledgers sometime around 1871. And no one has ever offered an explanation as to why. What the old-timers in that part of the state will tell you, if you catch them in the right mood, is that the trouble began the summer they drained the well. It had stood for nearly 200 years. Stone-lined hand, dug, sunk 30 feet into the red Virginia earth. Generations of families had drawn water from it without incident, and when the last owners decided the supply had finally run dry, they hired 4 men to pump it out and seal the opening for good. And the men arrived on a Monday morning. By Tuesday evening, 2 of them had refused to return. By Wednesday, the other 2 had left the county entirely. And when a 5th man was finally persuaded to go down and examine what they had found, he came back up in less than 10 minutes, climbed into his wagon, and drove away without collecting his pay. No one ever recorded what was at the bottom of that well. What was recorded, in a private letter later, discovered among the estate papers of a Lynchburg attorney, was that the room below had not been dug by the water. It had been built. Before we continue with the story of the Vawses farm and what lay beneath it, if you're new here, welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell us what state or city you're listening from. We'd love to know where our listeners are finding us tonight, because the story of what was built at the bottom of that well, and who built it, and why it had to be sealed away and forgotten, that is a story that stretches back further than the farm itself. It begins with a war that most people have stopped talking about, and it ends with a secret that 3 families spent the better part of 30 years trying to bury. To understand what was found beneath the Vawses property, you have to understand she music. What that part of Virginia was in the years before the Civil War, and what it became in the years after. The hill country west of Lynchburg, in the counties that fold up against the Blue Ridge, was not plantation country in the way that the Tidewater was plantation country. The farms were smaller there, the terrain too broken and rocky for the kind of large-scale tobacco cultivation that had made dynasties out of families along the James River. What the hill farmers had instead was self-sufficiency and insularity, a stubborn independence that made them suspicious of outsiders and intensely protective of whatever they'd managed to carve out of the land. The Vawses family had been on their particular piece of ground since the 1680s. Welsh by origin, they had come over with a small group of other settlers during the early colonial period and had slowly worked their way inland, away from the coast, away from the larger towns, until they found a hollow between 2 ridges that suited them. They built a stone house there, dug a well, he cleared a few acres of timber, and settled in for the long haul. By the time of the Revolution, they were 3 generations deep. By the 1840s, they were 5. Nathaniel Vawses was the head of the household in the years that interest us. A man in his mid-50s by the late 1850s. Thick through the shoulders, quieter than his neighbors remembered his father being. He had 2 sons, Emmett and Calhoun, both grown by then and working the farm alongside him. He had a wife, Dorothea, who had grown up a Pendleton from over in Amherst County, and whose family brought with them a particular set of beliefs about how certain things ought to be handled. He had a daughter, Louisa, who was in 1858, and who kept a journal that would later become the primary source for everything we know about what happened on that farm in the years that followed. The Vawses were not wealthy, but they were not poor. They owned 3 enslaved people a man named George, a woman named Hattie, and Hattie's son, a boy of about 12 called Wren, and the legal and moral machinery that kept those three people in bondage was something that Nathaniel Vawses had inherited along with the farm and the well and the stone house and everything else. He had not chosen it precisely. He had not refused it either. What mattered for the purposes of what came later was the geography of the farm itself. The hollow was narrow. The ridges on either side were steep enough to make travel difficult, and the single dirt road that connected the property to the county road was bad enough in summer and nearly impassable in winter. The nearest neighbor, a man named Crockett Farley, who ran a small gristmill on the creek about 2 miles south, was close enough to be called upon in an emergency, but far enough away to be effectively invisible on a daily basis. The Vawses were, in a very real sense, their own world. The well sat in the center of the yard between the house and the barn. It was old enough that no one then living could remember its construction, though family tradition held that it had been sunk by the original Welsh settlers, Nathaniel's great-grandfather's people, sometime around 1690. It was lined with dry, fitted fieldstone all the way down, and it produced clean, cold water music year-round. In the summer, you could lean over the opening and feel the cool air rising from below, and in the winter, the stone lip was often the only thing in the yard not white with frost. Louisa Vawses wrote about the well several times in her journal before the trouble started. Not in any way that suggested she found it remarkable, but in the offhand way you mention something that has always been there, a landmark, a given, the fixed point around which the rest of the property orbited. She mentioned drawing water from it in the early mornings. She mentioned her brother Emmett once dropping a bucket into it and having to fish it out with a loop of wire. She mentioned how, on very still nights in the summer, you could sometimes hear a sound coming up from it, a low, irregular sound that she described as being like breathing, but which she immediately attributed to the wind finding its way through the rock somewhere far below. She was 17. The sound, she noted, made her uneasy. But uneasy was not unusual on the Vawses farm in the summer of 1858. The summer of 1858 was the summer everything changed. And it changed because of something that happened 20 miles away and had nothing directly to do with the Vawses at all. A man named Josiah Trent, who owned a larger farm over toward Rustburg in Campbell County, had been part of a network, loosely organized, carefully concealed, that had been moving enslaved people northward through the hill country for the better part of 15 years. It was dangerous work, and it was not work that Trent had music taken on out of any pure abolitionist conviction. He had stumbled into it, from what the records suggest, because through a series of circumstances that had left him financially and morally entangled with a Quaker merchant in Lynchburg named Caleb Drummond, and the two men had made a quiet arrangement that had, by 1858, helped a significant number of people reach the Free States via a route that wound through the mountain hollows and over the ridge into the counties of Western Virginia. In June of 1858, Josiah Trent was caught. The music, the precise circumstances of his arrest, were reported in the Lynchburg, Virginian newspaper on the 14th of June. Louisa Vawses mentions reading about it, though she does not say where she obtained the paper. And the arrest sent a tremor through every household in the hill country that had any connection to what Trent had been doing, because Trent had not been working alone, and the authorities knew it. Moreover, they were prepared to be patient about finding out who else was involved. Nathaniel Vawses read the newspaper report with the same expression he wore when examining a fence post that had been improperly set. A kind of dry, careful assessment that gave nothing away, Then he folded the paper and put it in the fire. 3 nights later, a man Louisa had never seen before appeared at the back door of the stone house after midnight. She heard him through her bedroom window, heard the low knock, heard her father's voice, heard the back door open and close. She did not go downstairs. She wrote in her journal the next morning that she had counted at least 2 voices besides her father's, and that she had heard at one point the sound of the barn door opening, and then a long time later closing again. Of course, she did not know yet what she was hearing, but she remembered it. Remembered it with the kind of careful precision that suggests she already understood, even at 17, that what was happening on her father's farm was not something that could be safely spoken about. What Nathaniel Vawter had become involved in, when or how deeply, through what connection, was something that Louisa would spend years trying to reconstruct. What she established eventually was that her father had been part of Trent's network for at least 4 years before the arrest, and that the route that passed through the Vawters' Hollow had made use of a feature of the property that no county surveyor had ever had reason to examine closely: the well. Specifically, what was below the well, because the well was not and had never been simply a well, and 30th down, just below the water table's lower edge, where the natural seepage from the ridge above had kept the upper shaft damp and the stone dark with moisture. The shaft did not end in a clay floor. It opened, it widened, it became something else entirely. Whoever had dug the original well, and the timing, as it turned out, was critical, had gone down through the rock, not to find water, but to connect with something already there, a natural fissure in the limestone that ran roughly north to south beneath the hollow. And into that fissure, at some point in the distant past, someone had done deliberate work. They had cut the ceiling higher. They had laid a rough stone floor. They had shored up the walls with timbers that by 1858 were old enough to be beginning to fail. They had created a 30ft below the surface of the Vawters' farmyard, a room that by the time the 4 workmen were hired to drain and seal the well in 1871 had held human beings for a very long time. To understand what the room meant, you have to understand how it worked. And to understand how it worked, you have to go further back than Nathaniel Vawter. Further back even than the network that Josiah Trent had been running through the hill country. The limestone country of central Virginia is riddled with caves and natural passages. It is the same geology that produces the famous caverns further to the north, the ones that became tourist attractions in the 19th century. But the commercially celebrated caverns were only the visible portion of a far more extensive underground landscape, a one that the indigenous people of the region had known about for centuries before the first European settlers arrived, and one that the settlers themselves had stumbled upon in pieces as they dug foundations and wells and root cellars across the landscape. The Welsh settlers who came to the Vawters' Hollow in the 1680s were miners by tradition. Back home in the valleys of Wales, you learned early to read the landscape for what it hid below, for coal seams and lead deposits, and the passages that connected them. When the man who would become Nathaniel Vawter's great-great-grandfather sank his well into the red Virginia earth, he was not surprised to find that the rock opened below the waterline. He had been looking for it. He had sounded the ground with a steel rod, the way he had been taught, and then he had found the hollow place before he ever broke the surface. What he built down there in those first years of the settlement, before the colony was established enough to make such things anyone else's business, was a storage room, a place to keep things that shouldn't freeze in winter and shouldn't spoil in the summer heat. Smoked meat, seed grain, the kind of reserves that meant the difference between a hard winter and a killing one. This is documented after a fashion in a fragment of a letter written in Welsh that was found decades later folded inside the cover of a Bible that had been in the Vawter family since the original emigration. The translation done by a scholar at a Virginia college in the 1890s who had been given the letter without being told where it came from. He described a room below the family's water source, cool and dry, suitable for preservation, accessible only through the well shaft above. For the better part of a century, that is presumably what it was. A cold cellar with an unusually difficult point of entry, used and then forgotten as the family grew and built proper above-ground storage and stopped needing to lower themselves through a well shaft to get at their preserved pork. By the 1850s, Nathaniel Vawter, who had known about the room since childhood, had been shown it by his own father, who had been shown it by his had repurposed it in a way that his Welsh ancestor, digging into the limestone with his miner's rod and his survivalist arithmetic, could not have imagined. The room below the well had become a stop on a route that moved human beings through darkness towards something that might eventually resemble light. How many people had passed through it over the years that Nathaniel Vawter was connected to Trent's network cannot be established precisely. Louisa in her journal eventually pieced together that the number was more than 40 and possibly closer to 80. People who had arrived at the Vawters' farm in the night, been lowered through the well shaft via rope, and at a board seat spent between 1 and 4 days in the room below, and then been moved on to the next point in the chain. The room had a supply of food and water kept there for precisely this purpose. It had a lamp and enough oil to last several days. It had, Louisa noted, a collection of blankets that her mother Dorothea had been acquiring quietly for years. Good woolen blankets, not the thin ones, so that whoever came through would not be cold. Dorothea Pendleton Vawter, it turned out, was not merely aware of what her husband was doing. She was an active and essential part of it. This was the part of the story that the letter found in the Lynchburg attorney's estate papers touched upon most obliquely. The letter that described the room as having been built, not dug, because that word, built, was understood by the attorney's family to mean something specific. The attorney, whose name was Edmund Caskey, had represented one of the families involved in the investigation that followed Trent's arrest. And then the letter had been written to him by a client who needed him to understand the nature of what they were dealing with. The room below the Vawters' well had been built over decades into something that people could survive in. That was the horror and the miracle of it simultaneously. That someone had taken a natural crack in the limestone 30 feet underground and made it livable. Had installed the timber shoring, the plank floor, the ventilation that came from a second, much narrower fissure that opened somewhere on the hillside to the north, concealed behind a growth of mountain laurel. Had thought through what a human being would need to survive 2, 3, 4 days in the dark below the earth. That care that sustained specific long-term care was not something that Nathaniel Vawter had done alone or quickly on or without help. It was the work of years. It was the work possibly of more than one generation. And the nature of that work, its deliberateness, its human scale, the thought that had gone into the blankets and the lamp oil and the ventilation, was precisely what disturbed the men who came to drain and seal the well in 1871. Years after the war had ended and the legal reason for the room no longer existed. The room was empty by then, but it was not abandoned in the way that an unused space is abandoned. It was preserved. Every object in it was in its place. The lamp was trimmed and had oil in it. The blankets were folded. There was a tin cup on a ledge cut into the limestone, and inside the cup was a folded piece of paper, and on the paper was a list of names. And the list of names on the paper, in the tin cup, was what sent the fifth workman up out of the well without collecting his pay. He could read not well but enough, and what he saw on that list in a hollow 30 theft underground on a farm in central Virginia in 1871 was not what he had expected to find. He had expected maybe a root cellar, maybe an old cache of someone's hidden valuables. What he found instead was evidence of something that, in the years immediately following the Civil War and Reconstruction's beginning, carried a weight that was difficult to calculate. He left. He told his employer, a Lynchburg contractor named Silas Poor, only that the well needed to be sealed from the top and left alone, and that he would not discuss his reasons. Silas Poor, a practical man who recognized when a conversation was over. He sealed the well and billed the estate, and said nothing further about it to anyone, at least not for several years. It was Poor who eventually wrote the letter that ended up in Edmund Caskey's estate papers. He wrote it, as best as can be determined, sometime around 18, in response to a legal inquiry that Caskey was conducting on behalf of an unnamed party who had an interest in the Vawses property. In the letter, Poor described what his workmen had seen. He described the room, trasher music, trotro the blankets, the lamp, the ventilation shaft. He described the tin cup and the folded paper. He did not reproduce the names on the list, but he described the paper's appearance: old, folded many times, written in at least 2 different hands. The ink faded to a pale brown at the top and darker, more recent, toward the bottom, as if the list had been started decades earlier and added to over a long period of time. Edmund Caskey's response to this letter is not preserved. But what is preserved in the courthouse records of Campbell County, which were not subject to the same careful editing that apparently affected the records of the county, where the Vawses farm was located, is a deed transfer dated 1877, in which the Vawses farm changed hands for a price substantially below its market value. And the purchaser was a holding company whose principals included a name that appears in the records of the Virginia legislature in the 1870s, a man named Cornelius Dabney, who had been a member of the county court during the antebellum period and who had, according to contemporary accounts, been deeply invested in the investigation of the network that Josiah Trent had been operating. Dabney had not found what he was looking for in 1858. The investigation that followed Trent's arrest had been thorough, but it had not reached the Vawses farm. Nathaniel Vaught had been careful, and the hollow was remote, and the people who knew about the room below the well were either dead or silent. Trent himself, it appears, had never told anyone exactly where the rote went after it left his property. This was almost certainly a deliberate design feature of the network. The people who ran these routes understood, by the mid-1850s, that the weakest point in any chain is the person who knows the whole of it. Trent knew his stretch. The person who received travelers from Trent knew their stretch. And the intermediate contacts, the ones who moved people from one station to the next, were often given only what they needed to complete their own leg of the journey, with no knowledge of what came before or after. A man arrested at one point could give up only what he knew, which was not the whole picture. Nathaniel Vaught, therefore, was not a name that appeared in the investigation of Trent's network. He was not interviewed. His farm was not searched. The investigators who spent the summer of 1858 combing the hill country may well have driven past the mouth of the Vawses Hollow without stopping, their attention directed to farms and mills and crossroads communities that had been named by someone. And the Vawses Hollow had not been named by anyone who was talking. What Cornelius Dabney brought to the search, what he was still pursuing, apparently nearly 20 years after the fact, was not information from the investigation itself, but something more personal and more persistent. He had been a member of the county court during the antebellum period. He had been, from what can be inferred from the records that survive, the kind of man for whom the network that Trent had been running represented not merely a legal violation, but a personal affront, an affront to an entire system of order and hierarchy and property law that he had built his life around, and that the war had dismantled, and that he was spending his post-war years attempting to rebuild in whatever form remained available to him. He had made it his business, in the years after the war, to learn what the investigation of 1858 had failed to establish. He had talked to people. He had paid for information, and he had read documents that other people considered closed. And by 1877 he had arrived, through a chain of reasoning and inquiry that cannot now be fully reconstructed, at the Vawses, a music farm, and the sealed well. What he expected to find there is not known. What he found, in the years between 1877 and 1879, when he owned the land, is also not known. The farm was quiet. The well was sealed. The house was deteriorating. And then the fire. Fires in rural Virginia in 1879 were not inherently suspicious. Old wooden structures burned. Chimneys failed. Sparks from a lantern could take a barn in minutes. The fact that this particular fire destroyed a stone house, not a wooden one, but a structure built from field stone that had been standing since the 1680s, was somewhat more unusual. Stone houses do not burn the way wooden ones do. What would burns in a stone house is everything inside it: the floors, the ceiling, the furniture, the papers, the books, the accumulated physical record of nearly 2 centuries of a family's presence on the land. The fire destroyed whatever remained in the house, whatever Nathaniel Vaught had kept, whatever Dorothea had stored, whatever traces of what had happened in the years between 1854 and 1861 had survived the war and Nathaniel's music death and the workmen and the sale. All of it was ash by the time the fire was done. The well survived. The room below the well survived. But the connection between the room and the records that might have explained it was severed. He purchased the property in 1877. He did not appear to have done anything with it immediately. The farm sat empty for 2 years, the house gradually deteriorating and the barn roof beginning to sag. And then, in 1879, a fire of uncertain origin destroyed the stone house down to its foundations. The well, being stone and 30 feet deep, survived. But by the time of the fire, the document that had been in the tin cup at the bottom of the well, the list of names written in 2 hands, faded at the top and dark at the bottom, was no longer a music there. It had disappeared sometime between 1871 and 1879, and no one has ever been able to establish when it was taken or by whom. What remained, for those who knew where to look, were the names themselves, not on paper, but in memory. And memory, as anyone who has spent time with it knows, is both more durable and more mutable than paper. Louisa Vaught had not been on the farm in 1871. She had married in 1865 a man named Prout from over in Rockbridge County, and she had been living 40 miles away when the workmen came to drain the well. But she had known about the room since she was 17, had known, in fact, more about it than her journal revealed during her father's lifetime, because there were pages she had cut from the journal with scissors, carefully removing them without disturbing the binding. The cuts were still visible when the journal eventually came to light years later. Whatever she had written on those pages was gone. The journal itself was a plain thing, a bookkeeper's ledger that she had repurposed for personal writing. Its original columns of numbers, still faintly visible beneath her entries, wherever she had started a new page, without completely covering what was printed there. She had been writing in it since she was 15, and the early entries were what you would expect from a girl that age in rural Virginia. Observations about the weather, notes about the garden, accounts of church services, and the occasional visit to Lynchburg. There was a period when she had been keeping careful track of a young man from the Cabell family over in Appomattox County, noting his visits and the length of time he stayed, and whether he had spoken to her father. And that thread simply stopped in early 1858 without comment or resolution, as if she had decided that certain narratives were better not. A music followed to their conclusions in writing. What remained in the journal, after the cut pages were gone, was still substantial. Years of entries covering the war and her marriage, and her early years in Rockbridge County, and the births of her children. But the gap was visible. And not just in the literal sense of the missing leaves, but in the texture of the writing around the gap. The entries immediately before and after the removed section had the careful, slightly formal quality of writing done with an awareness of being read, not falsely cheerful but measured, deliberately unremarkable. The writing of someone who has decided consciously what to leave in and what to leave out. The entries that were cut had covered, based on the page numbers and the dates of the entries before and after, approximately 14 months, from the autumn of 1858 through the end of 1859, the months after Trent's arrest, the months when the network went quiet and the route north closed, and whatever was happening in the room below the Vawses well was happening without any of the usual movement of the chain above it. 14 months. The entries for that period gone. What she wrote in the resumed journal in January of 1860 was about a snowfall. 2 feet of snow in the hollow. The road to the county road completely impassable. Her brothers shoveling out the barn and the well. She described the well in that entry the same way she had always described it. A landmark, a given, the fixed point around which the property orbited. She said nothing about what was 30 feet below it. She had made her decision about what to keep and what to cut. She had been 18 years old when the 14 months began and 19 years old when they ended. She had lived through whatever happened in that hollow during those months in that stone house with her father and her mother and her brothers and the 3 people who were legally their property, and the room below the yard that was legally nothing at all. Whatever she knew, whatever she had been part of, or had witnessed or had simply heard through a bedroom window, without being told directly, she had decided to carry it herself. Not to put it down on paper. Not to leave it where a future stranger could find it and make of it what they would. She lived until 1903. She outlived her husband and 2 of her 4 children, and watched the world change in ways that the girl who had kept a ledger journal in the Virginia Hill Country could not have anticipated. She never returned to the Vawses farm after her marriage. She never, in any of the letters or documents that survived from her later life, mentioned it directly. Her music, and the only exception was the letter to her daughter about the fire. The one with the strange closing about hoping the trouble might now be allowed to rest. Her daughter, who had never known the farm and had no particular reason to find the letter's language unusual, had kept it among her own papers without thinking much about it. It was a letter from her mother about a fire at a property she had never visited. It was the kind of letter you keep because it's from your mother, not because of what it says. Louisa was still alive in 1879 when the stone house burned. She wrote about it Twartre music, Twartre in a letter to her daughter. A letter that survived because it was among the papers of the Prout family and had no obvious connection to anything that anyone was looking for. In the letter, Mears, she described, hearing about the fire from a neighbor who had ridden over to tell her. She described her feelings with a kind of controlled brevity that suggests she was writing with the awareness that letters can be read by people other than their intended recipients. She said only that she was sorry the house was gone, that it had been a good house, and that she hoped whatever had been troubling that particular piece of ground might now be allowed to rest. It was a strange way to put it. Her daughter, apparently, did not find it strange enough to ask about. And for a long time, a very long time, that was where the trail ended. The trail might have ended there permanently, buried under a fire and a land transfer and a carefully edited courthouse ledger, if not for a woman named Prudence Farley. And Prudence was the granddaughter of Crockett Farley, the man with the grist mill 2 miles south of the Vawses Hollow, the nearest neighbor, the man close enough to be called upon in an emergency. Crockett Farley had died in 1883, leaving behind a mill that his son ran with indifferent success for another decade before selling it, and a box of personal papers that sat in the attic of the family's house for 40 years before Prudence, cleaning out after her parents' deaths in 1921, opened it and found what was inside. The papers in the box were exactly what you would expect from a 19th-century mill operator in the Virginia Hill Country. Ledgers, correspondence about grain prices, a deed for a small parcel of land, several letters from relatives in Tennessee, and one thing you would not expect: a sealed envelope, unaddressed in Crockett Farley's handwriting to no one in particular, with the instruction written on the outside, "Do not open until I am gone." Another 20 years. Crockett Farley had been dead for 38 years when Prudence found the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered on both sides in her grandfather's careful, cramped hand. It was dated July 1868, and it described, in the methodical way of a man who had spent his life keeping accounts, what Crockett Farley had known about the Vawses farm and the room beneath the well. He had known more than might be expected from a neighbor 2 miles away. He had known because he had been part of it. And here the letter paused, not in the physical sense, but in the way a man's handwriting changes when he shifts from reporting facts to reporting feelings. Crockett Farley's penmanship throughout most of the document was the careful, even script of someone who had kept accounts for decades, who had learned early that legibility was a form of honesty and that slanted. Hurried writing was the habit of people who didn't want to be held to what they'd written. But in the paragraph where he described his own involvement, the letters got slightly larger, slightly less regular, as if the act of finally committing this to paper after 9 years of silence had unlocked something in the hand that the mind hadn't quite caught up to yet. He wrote that he had never considered himself a brave man. He had considered himself, above all else, a practical man. And the practical calculation he had made sometime in the early 1850s, when Nathaniel Vaught had come to him with the proposal, or rather when had not come to him with a proposal, had simply begun to talk about certain things in certain ways over the course of several visits, feeling him out, reading his responses with the patience of a man who understood that a thing said too directly could not be unsaid, was that the risk of involvement was manageable, and the risk of knowing and doing nothing was of a different kind. And that in the end, the blankets and the lamp oil were small things to provide. What he had not anticipated, he wrote, was how the knowledge would settle into him, how it would become part of his daily mental furniture in a way that the actual labor of providing supplies was not. You could finish cutting the wick on a lamp and put the lamp in a box and hand the box to Nathaniel Vaught and walk home, and the lamp was done. On about the knowledge of why the lamp existed and who would use it and where it would go. That did not finish. That stayed. He had not been religious in any formal sense. His wife had been Presbyterian. He had attended services with her and thought his own thoughts during the sermons. But after the first year of his involvement with what was happening at the Vawses farm, he found himself thinking in the idle moments of the mill, the hours when the water was doing the work, and he was only watching, about certain passages from the sermons he had half listened to, about being a stranger in a strange land, about the darkness of the valley. These were, he acknowledged in the letter, not thoughts that helped with anything practical. But they stayed with him, and they made the mill feel different, made the ordinary sound of the water on the wheel carry something it hadn't carried before. Some additional weight that he could feel, but not name, not as a station on the road. His mill was too visible, too accessible, too often visited by people who had no business knowing what was happening there. But as a supplier and a watcher, he had provided some of the lamp oil. He had provided the blankets, buying them from a dry goods dealer in Lynchburg in small quantities over several years, never enough at once to attract notice. And he had watched the road from his mill for signs of the investigators who were combing the hill country in the months after Trent's arrest. And he had sent word when they were coming. The paper in the envelope described all of this in the detached, unpast, tense manner of a man making a final accounting. But it also described something else, something that Crockett Farley had seen on a specific night in September of 1859, 14 months after Trent's arrest. When the investigation had appeared to die down and the network was cautiously resuming its operations. He had been returning from his mill later than usual, because a wheel shaft had broken and he had spent the afternoon repairing it. He was on the road north of his property, walking his horse in the dark. The moon was down, or nearly, and the road was bad enough that riding wasn't wise, when he saw lights at the Vawses farm that should not have been there. Not in the house, in the yard. 2 lanterns moving in a specific pattern that he recognized from the times he had visited the farm on legitimate business. One at the barn door, one at the well. But there was a third light, one that appeared and disappeared in a way that he understood, after a moment. Meant that someone was going up and down the well shaft, that the lantern was being carried below, and then brought back up. He stopped on the road and watched. He counted. Over the course of approximately an hour and a half, the third light went down and came up 11 times. He did not approach. He did not call out. He went home and went to bed, and in the morning he went to the mill and said nothing to anyone, but he counted 11, and he wrote that number down in 1868, 9 years later, with the care of someone who understood that what he had seen was a data point in a larger account that might someday need to be presented in full. 11 trips down the shaft and back up, and in an hour and a half on a September night in 1859, each trip taking approximately 8 or 9 minutes. The rope and the board seat could carry one person at a time. He knew the mechanism, had helped Nathaniel Vawter lower a sack of seed down there once, years before, when the storage function was still the official story. One person at a time, 8 to 9 minutes each way. 11 trips. Not all of those trips were people going down. Some of them would be supplies. Some of them would be the rope itself being rigged and derigged. But some of them, perhaps 5 or 6, perhaps as many as 8, represented human beings being lowered 30 feet into the earth on a September night. This was not the most remarkable thing Crockett Farley had written down. The most remarkable thing was the final paragraph of his account, which described what he had seen on his next visit to the Vawses farm 3 weeks after the September night. He had gone over, as he sometimes did, to return a borrowed tool and to pass an hour talking about the harvest. He had found Nathaniel Vawter in the yard, near the well, doing something that Farley initially took for ordinary maintenance, clearing leaves from the stone lip, checking the rope. But as he got closer, he saw that Nathaniel was not cleaning the well. He was examining it, running his hands along the stones of the upper shaft, leaning over the opening, listening. Farley greeted him. Nathaniel straightened and said hello, and said nothing was wrong, said only that he had thought he heard something, and was checking. Farley asked what kind of something. Nathaniel Vawter was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Something like a voice, but probably just the wind." Farley did not say anything. He handed over the borrowed tool, stayed for 20 minutes, and left. But as he walked back down the road toward the mill, he found himself thinking about the September night, and the 11 trips, and whether all of the people who had gone down the shaft had subsequently come back up. He never asked Nathaniel Vawter about it. He wrote the question down instead in 1868 in his careful mill keeper's hand, and sealed it in an envelope, and left it for someone else to find. When Prudence Farley read the paper in 1921, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then she got up, put the paper back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the box, and put the box back in the attic. She did not tell anyone what she had found, and not immediately, but she had read it, and she had done the arithmetic. Prudence Farley was 53 years old in 1921. A practical woman who had worked as a school teacher in Amherst County for most of her adult life. She was not given to flights of imagination, and she was not, by any of the accounts that survived, easily frightened. But the arithmetic in her grandfather's letter had lodged in her mind the way a splinter lodges in a finger. Not always painful, but always present. It took her 6 years to do anything about it. In 1927, she wrote a letter to a history professor at a small college in Roanoke, who had been conducting research into what was then beginning to be discussed cautiously as the Underground Railroad, the network of routes and hiding places and human courage that had moved people northward before the war. And the professor, a man named Elbert Hogue, had published several papers on the subject and was known to be collecting personal accounts and documents. Prudence wrote to him carefully. She described the letter from her grandfather in general terms, without specifying what it contained. She asked whether he was aware of any documented routes through the hill country of central Virginia, and whether the Vawters' farm in the county she named appeared in any of his research. Hogue wrote back within a week. The letter he sent her was 3 pages long, and it began with a sentence that made Prudence put down her coffee and sit very still for a moment. He knew the Vawters' farm not from living memory, but from 2 other sources that he had been unable to reconcile, until her letter arrived. The first source was a brief account unpublished in a Pennsylvania Quaker newsletter in 1864, written by a man who described himself only as having traveled through the mountain country of Virginia, some years before the war. The account was fragmentary and deliberately vague, the kind of thing written by someone who understood that the details could still be dangerous even with the war ongoing. But it described a farm in a hollow, a well, and a descent into the earth that the writer compared, with an evident attempt at lightness, to going down into the mine country of the old country. He said that what he found below was unexpected. Not a cave, he wrote, but a room. And in the room, 6 other people waiting. 7 people in the room below the Vawters' well at the same time. In the account's timeline, this would have been sometime in 1857 or early 1858 before Trent's arrest. And the second source was a collection of brief notes written in a cramped hand and filed without explanation among the papers of the Lynchburg Quaker merchant. Torture-musician Caleb Drummond, the man who had entangled Josiah Trent in the network in the first place. Drummond had died in 1869, and his papers had been donated to a Quaker meeting in Philadelphia, where they had sat in a trunk in a back room for half a century before being cataloged. In those notes, written partly in English and partly in a personal shorthand, that Hogue had spent considerable effort decoding, were references to a station that Drummond called the Stone Bottom. Supplies delivered. Route confirmed. Stone Bottom holding 7. Wrote north clear as of 14th. 7 again. But here was where the arithmetic became difficult. Where the splinter in Prudence's mind became something she could no longer ignore. The account published in the Pennsylvania Newsletter was written by a man who had passed through. He had gone down into the room and found 6 people waiting, making 7 total. He had subsequently been moved north along the route. He had survived. He had written about it. The notes in Drummond's papers described Stone Bottom holding 7 on a specific date. And then, a week later in the same sequence of notes, there was a single entry that said only Stone Bottom. No word. Wrote north closed. Drummond's shorthand for the next entry, decoded by Hoke, appeared to read, Trouble at Trent's. Advise caution all stations. The arrest, June 1858. The network going quiet. But here was what no one had ever been able to establish. What happened to the 7 people who were in the room below the Vawses well when the route north closed? If the route closed suddenly, so it appeared to Hoke, if Nathaniel Vaught received the word that the investigators were coming, that the usual contacts could not be reached, that the network had gone to ground, then the 7 people in the room 30 faft below his farmyard were stranded. They could not go north. They could not go back south without enormous risk. They could not emerge through the well shaft in daylight without being seen. They were below the earth in a room that had been built for temporary occupation, with supplies calculated for days, not weeks. Hoke had found no record of what happened to them, and he had found no account of 7 people emerging from the Virginia hill country in the summer of 1858 and making it to the Free States. He had found no record of arrests either. No group of escaped enslaved people captured in the hill country in that period, which might have been expected to generate documentation. He had found nothing, which was its own kind of answer. When Prudence Farley read Hoke's letter, she went to the attic and took her grandfather's envelope back down. She read again the final paragraph. The description of Nathaniel Vaught at the well 3 weeks after the September 1859 night. The something like a voice. The it's probably just the wind. The September 1859 night was 15 months after Trent's arrest, 15 months after the route north closed, 15 months of silence from whatever was in the room below. And yet, on a September night in 1859, someone had been at the well with a lantern, going up and down 11 times over the course of an hour and a half. What Crockett Farley had seen that night, what he had counted and recorded and sealed in an envelope and been unable to bring himself to investigate further, was not. Prudence now understood. People being lowered into the room. It was people being brought up. The question that followed from that understanding was not comfortable. If someone was being brought up from the room 30 fav, below the Vaught's farmyard 15 months after the route closed and no further word came, brought up in the dark of a September night, one at a time over the course of an hour and a half, then what condition were they in? And were they alive? Were they all alive? How many had survived 15 months in a room designed for days? And if some of them had not survived, if the room had become in those 15 months of sealed silence something other than a refuge. Then what had Nathaniel Vaught done with them? Where had he put them? In a hollow in the Virginia Hill Country in the summer of 1858, with investigators combing the roads and asking questions at every farm within 20 miles. Where do you put the ones who didn't make it? There was, Prudence noticed, one detail in her grandfather's letter that she had initially passed over. He had described the Vaught's farm on his ordinary visits. He had described the yard, the barn, the stone house, the well. And in one of those descriptions, written in the context of explaining the layout, so that the letter would make sense to whoever eventually read it, he had mentioned that the area to the north of the well, between the well and the ridge, had been replanted with grass sometime around 1860. He mentioned it the way you mentioned something that struck you as slightly odd at the time, and that you filed away without knowing quite what to do with it. The grass was thicker there, he wrote, thicker and darker than the rest of the yard. Nathaniel had said he'd done some grading work, moving earth. Farley had nodded and thought no more of it, until he wrote the letter in 1868 and decided that it was worth including, just in case. What Prudence Farley thought when she read that detail, what she sat alone within her kitchen in 1927, with her grandfather's letter and a professor's carefully reasoned reply in front of her, is not recorded anywhere. But she had been a school teacher for 30 years. She was accustomed to following a chain of reasoning to its conclusion, even when the conclusion was difficult. She wrote back to Hoke. She told him about the envelope. She told him about the September night, and the Levin trips, and the thick dark grass to the north of the well. She asked him what he thought music it meant. Hoke's response took 2 weeks. When it came, it was shorter than his previous letter. A single page measured in its language. Careful. He wrote that he believed the Vaught farm had been an important station on a significant route, and that the events of 1858 had likely created a situation of extreme difficulty for everyone involved, including those who were sheltering in the room below the well. He wrote that the historical record was, in such cases, often incomplete by design. He wrote that he would like to visit the property, if it was still accessible, and that he would welcome the opportunity to conduct a careful examination of the grounds, particularly the area to the north of the well shaft. He never made the visit. He died in February of 1928, 4 months after writing the letter. From pneumonia, Prudence Farley lived until 1941. She gave Hoke's letters and her grandfather's envelope to a niece with instructions to put them in a safe place. The niece, who had never quite understood what the papers contained or why they mattered, put them in a box of family documents. The box eventually found its way, after several decades and several moves, to an archive at a small historical society in the hill country of central Virginia, where it was cataloged without particular attention and filed away. The farm itself, the Vaught's farm, the property that Cornelius Dabney had purchased in 1877 and whose stone house had burned in 1879, is still there. The land changed hands several more times over the years. The barn eventually fell. The well was sealed. A silas pour had been paid to seal it with stone and mortar. The area to the north, where the grass had grown thicker and darker after 1860, is now overgrown with cedar and sumac, the way abandoned ground in Virginia tends to go. The limestone below the hollow has never been formally surveyed. The room that was built there, 30 feet below the surface, accessible only through the shaft above, has never been officially documented or examined. The sealed well still sits in the middle of what used to be the yard. And the list of names that was in the tin cup at the bottom. The list written in 2 hands, faded at the top and dark at the bottom, started decades before the war and added to over years of use. That list is gone, removed before the fire, taken by someone who understood what it meant, and what it could prove, and what it was better for certain purposes to make disappear. Whether it was Cornelius Dabney, who took it, or someone working for him, or someone working against him. Whether the names were destroyed or merely hidden, whether they still exist somewhere in a box, or an envelope, or folded inside the cover of a book, is not known. What is known is that those names were real, that the people they belonged to were real, that they made a descent into the earth of Virginia in the years before the war, and trusted a stone room and a rope and a Welsh farmer's family to keep them safe until the route north opened again. The route did not open in time for all of them, and the ground to the north of the well is very flat, and the grass, even now, grows a little thicker there than it does anywhere else in the hollow. There is a particular kind of silence that exists around stories like this one. Not the silence of things that were never known, but the silence of things that were known by too many people to be entirely forgotten, and by too few people to become part of the official record. The Vawses farm's history, its concealed infrastructure, its role in the network, and the events of the summer and fall of 1858. The September night that Crockett Farley watched from the road was never secret in the absolute sense. Too many people had touched it. The workman who drained the well in 1871, Silas Poor, who sealed it, Edmund Caskey, who received the letter, Cornelius Dabney, who bought the land, Crockett Farley, who counted 11 and wrote it down, Louisa Prout, née Vawses, who cut pages from her journal, and then spent the rest of her life carefully not talking about what she had removed. All of these people knew something. None of them knew everything, and none of them were in a position, given the political climate of Reconstruction Virginia, given the ongoing danger of being connected to what Trent's network had been doing, or given the very specific legal jeopardy that attaches to certain kinds of knowledge, to say what they knew out loud in a form that would survive. The erasure was not the work of one person or one decision. It was the accumulated result of dozens of small choices made by people who were navigating an extremely complicated moral and legal landscape in a period when the wrong information in the wrong hands could destroy a family or worse. Nathaniel Vaught did not empty the courthouse ledgers. He did not burn his own house. He simply went on living on a farm in the Virginia hill country with a sealed well in the yard and a patch of ground to the north where the grass grew thick. He died in 1873, 2 years after the well was drained and sealed, and the cause of death recorded in the family Bible, Louisa kept the record, was listed as a winter fever. He was 68 years old. What he had done over the years that mattered was built something, not just the room. The room was older than him, was his inheritance from the Welsh ancestor who had first recognized what the limestone below offered. What he built was the system around it. The contacts, the timing, the supply chain of blankets and lamp oil and preserved food, the careful watching of the county road, the management of a secret that grew larger and more dangerous with every year it was maintained. And what happened in the summer of 1858, when the road closed and the people below the well were stranded? Whatever he decided in those weeks and months, whatever choices he made, whatever the thick grass to the north of the well eventually came to cover, those decisions were made by a man operating in the dark in every sense, with no good options, no outside authority to appeal to, and no way to ask for help without destroying everything he had built and everyone who depended on it. We do not know what he decided. We can only see the outcome, the sealed well, the altered ground, the missing pages, the paper removed from the tin cup before the fire. What we can say, what the evidence, partial and fragmentary as it is, allows us to say is that the room below the Vawses well was built in service of a purpose that was, whatever else it was, an act of sustained and music, deliberate human care. Someone thought about what a person would need to survive in the dark. Someone counted the days and calculated the oil, and folded the blankets, and cut the ventilation shaft, through the limestone to the hillside above. Someone kept a list of names. The names are gone, but the room is still there, below the sealed well, in the hollow between the ridges. The timbers that shore the walls are older now, and the plank floor has probably collapsed, and the limestone has been working at the mortar for a century and a half. But the natural fissure that the Welsh miner found when he sounded the ground in 1690 does not care about time. It is still there, cool and dark, running north to south beneath the Virginia earth. And on the wall of that room, Louisa's journal mentions this, in what appears to be a transcription of something her father told her. Noted in one of the entries that was not cut out. On the wall of that room, scratched into the limestone by the people who waited there are marks. Not words, as far as Louisa's account suggests. Marks, lines, the kind you make to count the days. She does not say how many lines there are. She does not say whether anyone ever finished counting them. That is where the record ends, in a room 30 feet underground, in the dark of the Virginia hill country, with a lamp that has oil enough for several more days, and blankets folded on a plank floor, and marks on the limestone wall that no one has counted in a very long time. This mystery shows us something about the limits of what official records can hold and what they choose to discard, about the gap between what happened and what was allowed to be remembered. The Vawses farm story did not disappear because it was unimportant. It disappeared because it was important in ways that made powerful people very uncomfortable in a period when comfort and power and music were closely aligned. What do you think happened in that room in the summer of 1858? Do you believe all of the names on that list eventually made it north? Or does the thick grass and the silence tell a different story? Leave your comment below. We read every one of them. And if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those last few sections, share it with someone who loves history and doesn't mind losing a little sleep over it. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and join us for the next story, because there are more rooms below the surface of American history than any official record will ever admit. And we intend to find them. We'll see you in the next video.